I'm delighted to be joined by Bernardine Evaristo. Very exciting. Your book, your first non-fiction, I think, is that right? Yes. Manifesto on Never Giving Up is out tomorrow.
Yes.
There's quite a lot in it about these whole issues of misogyny and racism. If we could just sort of pick up a bit on what Anushka's been talking about. In the book, you talk about how too often in the media, when they are talking about violent crime against women, they somehow characterise it in a way that almost makes one think that somehow a contributor was the woman herself, that she was somehow to blame. Do you see any sign of improvement in that?
Well, I think that was certainly the case when I was a young woman in the 80s, you know, when they were reporting instances of violence, sexual violence against women. Often the kind of news reporting would suggest that there was something wrong with the woman, that there was something about the way she was dressing and so on and so forth. I don't think they do that quite so much these days, which is a good thing. But there's definitely something wrong with the way it's reported. If you think about Sarah Everard and the way that her case gained the national, struck the national consciousness, and then you think about the two sisters who were killed, you know, in the park in Clapham, and how that was completely overlooked. So, you know, there are various issues here.
And, just on different instances of discrimination, obviously we've all been looking at what looks to be a form of institutional sexism in the justice system that's sort of thrown up by the Sarah Everard case. But it's worse, isn't it, for women who are people of colour, that there's a sort of double discrimination there?
Yeah, definitely. But that's not my area of expertise. And I don't write about that in the book.
No, but what you do write about is the appalling racism that you and your family suffered when you were growing up, which doesn't... it just wasn't that long ago. Well,
it was. It was the 60s.
Well, for some of us of a certain age, it doesn't feel that long ago.
The 60s and 70s, you know, our house was, in a sense, under siege. You know, I grew up in Woolwich, which was then a very white area, and we used to get our windows smashed in a lot by local thugs, and they'd disappear, and then as soon as the windows were smashed, we'd know it'd happen again. My father came from Nigeria in 1949, and he most definitely suffered the kind of racism that was evident then. And don't forget that the Race Relations Act didn't really come into full force until the mid-70s. So people couldn't be prosecuted for their racist behaviour before then. And so I do talk about this in terms of my heritage in the book, yeah.
And so, plainly, there have been improvements. There is there's certainly not so much explicit racism as we had then. And part of the progress is to do with education. And one of the things that was very, very striking, I don't know if you looked at all or listened at all to Boris Johnson's speech today, but right at the end of the speech, he said that attacking Churchill as a racist was, in his words, rewriting Britain's national story. Now, you know, frankly, there are many instances of Churchill throughout his life saying very racist things. It is a fact about Churchill, which I think many people would say we simply have to understand. It's not to dismiss the importance of Churchill, but it's to understand him in the round. Whereas Boris Johnson seems to imply that if we talk about his racism, there's a phrase he uses that we're betraying our children's education, but many would say the reverse is true.
Well, I think that's a really ridiculous comment to make, actually, and I think it's our duty to rewrite history, because the way in which history has been recorded has been from very particular perspectives, essentially white and male. Yeah. And I think we also need to understand that historical figures were complex, and that people might have you know, had good qualities and also bad qualities. But I think, you know, it's really very simplistic and childish to think that we're not allowed to look back at history from the 21st century and explore the things that were, you know, difficult and negative about it.
Sure. Steve, Bernardine's completely right, isn't she? Nobody's talking, or at least nobody sensible is talking about cancelling Winston Churchill. But it's perfectly reasonable to understand that there were certain attitudes he had that we would these days think of as appalling.
As Bernardine said it, I agreed with what you said. These are complex figures from history. They said things which we would not tolerate today. Equally, Churchill saved civilization, and I don't think civilization would have survived as it has done without him. So we can't be cancelling him. But
but who sensible wants to cancel?
No
Churchill?
one sensible wants to cancel Churchill. But you know, I do think it's appropriate that we look back at history and say, actually, no, those weren't the standards that we require today. But there's something about the way that we're relating to one another through all this. We do need to be a little bit gentler with one another. There's a lot going on in the world right now where people are polarising arguments as if we were stuck in irreconcilable conflict. And I want us to move beyond irreconcilable conflict and find new ways to talk to one another, to listen and to understand. And I think that that's what Bernardine is proposing by suggesting that these are complex figures and that we should look again at them. And I think that's a reasonable thing to propose. Of course it is.
Jess, I think you wanted to come in, didn't you?
Just to agree, really, although I would say to Steve's comment, I totally agree that we've got to find a way not to just be at each other's throats and be being vicious and things. But I'm afraid to say I don't think that the Prime Minister agrees with him. I'm afraid he finds a rich seam in people disagreeing with it, and he really, really leans into it. I think that it's absolutely right to think that, you know, lots of people who I hold very dear as heads of brilliant equalities movements were not perfect people. And just, by the way, Churchill also voted against votes for women very many times and was disliked by the Pankhursts greatly. And I think they went round behind him with a bell saying shame. So I think that that's important to know, as well as the good stuff that he did.
I mean, in your working life, I assume you've also found, as an artist and a writer, attitudes have changed. I mean, certainly when I've talked to other black writers, they've said 20, 25 years ago, it was almost impossible to get a hearing with an agent or with a publisher. And now, of course, things are better, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I talk about in the book. You know, my childhood was, my experience was really about being an outsider, coming from this interracial family in a very white area, not seeing black literature around me, certainly black people hardly featured on television, certainly weren't in Parliament until the 1980s. And then we look at how we've shifted today and, you know, society has become a lot more progressive. And of course, there's a lot more to do as well. Publishing is changing as I speak. In the last couple of years, you know, I think the publishing industry is really seriously looking at itself and trying to make sure that it becomes more inclusive of all kinds of communities.
And it's fantastic that you're on the A-level syllabus.
That's right, my novel Girl, Woman, Other is on the A-level syllabus. So
it is,
I love the idea that these 17, 18-year-olds are going to be engaging with my work.
Well, it richly deserved, and it's such a treat to have you here. So thank you so much for coming. I hope the book goes fantastically